Significant figures are one of those things that gives students a lot of problems throughout the semester. And I know I'll be taking points off almost every quiz or every exam that we have. Students will be losing points on significant figures. This is definitely one of those things you ought to consider putting some extra time in so that you get it down such that you don't miss those points. Because really, in a lot of ways, losing points for sig figs is throwing points away. So we're going to look at a multi-step problem here. We saw in class how to apply the rules for multiplication and division. We saw that those rules were different from addition and subtraction. And so we want to see how we can combine those two things. How do we combine addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, all in the same problem? And so we're looking at this problem, 112 plus 4.5 times 67.89. Now, there are parentheses there. Remember, when there are parentheses in a problem, we always do that particular portion of the problem first. In this case, however, due to order of operations, it wouldn't matter whether we had those parentheses there or not. Because if we remove them, we would have an addition and we would have a multiplication, and we would always do the multiplication first. So in this case, the parentheses are there for guidance, but they won't always be there, and you would have to be able to figure out the order of operations. So what we're going to do first is we are going to do this multiplication step. We are not going to round the numbers until the very end, but we're going to keep track of how many significant figures each of our answers along the way will have so that we can get the correct number at the very end. So let's work on this portion first, calculating what that 4.5 times 67.89 would be. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those two numbers that I'm multiplying together, and I'm going to figure out how many significant figures. And I tried to give you some that didn't have a lot of confusion so that you could see what the structure is in working through a problem like this. So you should be able to determine right away that that has 2 and this has 4. And you may notice the one thing that I do whenever I'm working with significant figures is I always keep track of how many significant figures a number has by putting the number above it and circling it. You will see this over and over and over on papers and in class and in some of these videos, how I will put those numbers up there just so that I don't forget. You might say, how about this number? Well, we can do that one as well. It has 3 significant figures, but we're not going to worry about the 112 until we get through the problem a little bit more. So let's go ahead and multiply those two together. I always like to organize these problems sort of like I would have in grade school. 4.5 times 67.89. Multiply those two things together and end up with 305.505. And you might say to yourself, why do you take all those digits if we're doing significant figures? And in reality, I don't round in these problems until the very end. So you're going to find that even though this is going to have fewer significant figures in this, I'm going to take all these digits forward in the rest of the calculation because it's going to make my answer be more accurate. So starting off with a number that had 4 significant figures, and we multiplied it by a number that has 2, and so this number here is going to have 2 significant figures. Okay, now how do we write a number like that with 2 significant figures? Well, if I were going to write that out and that were my final answer, I would write it as 3.1 times 10 squared. So if that were the only portion of the problem that I was doing was just that portion, that is what my answer would be. You also could write it as 310. Either one of those would be correct. They both have 2 significant figures. I'm going to carry that forward. So now my problem turns into 112 plus 305.505. But this only has 2 significant figures. And so you might ask yourself, which of those digits in that number are significant? Well, if I've got 2 significant figures and I want to figure out which one of the digits are significant, I'm going to start counting from the leftmost digit. 1, 2. So it's significant to that place right there. Now this number here, I said before, had 3 significant figures. So if I wanted to figure out what digit it was significant to, Start with the leftmost digit and count 1, 2, 3. It's significant to the 2 in the ones column. Now I'm going to do the addition portion. So again, I'm going to take this, I'm going to set it up as if I'm in grade school. 112 plus 305.505. And you might ask yourself, why did you set it up like that? Well, in reality, the decimal place would be there, so I align those two decimal places. But the one thing that I'm going to make sure that I have here, I'm going to make sure that I've brought these marks that show how many significant figures or what place this is significant to. So the 112 was significant to the 2, and the 305.505 was significant to that 0 right there, that place, the tens place. Now I'm going to go ahead and add them together. 5, 0, 5. I've got my decimal point. 2 plus 5 is 7. 1 plus 0 is 1. 3 plus 1 is 4. So 417.505. But notice what's missing is I didn't do anything with those marks indicating what place those numbers are significant to. So I'm just going to bring them down in the same place. So that would come down to here. This one would come down to that place. And so my answer is either going to be significant to this place or to this one. So I'm going to write this out in two different ways. The first, significant to that place. Okay, so I'm going to round to this place. I'm going to look at this place. It's greater than a 5. Look at the ones place. That's a 7. It's greater than a 5. So it would be 420. How many significant figures does 420 have? It has 2. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to round it to the ones place. So I'm going to look at the 10th, and I'm going to say, okay, 5. Okay, if I have a 5 or greater, I'm going to round up, and I would round that to 418. How many significant figures does 418 have? It has 3. So I have a choice between 420 or 418. One of those two is the answer to this problem. So what I'm going to do then is I'm always going to choose the answer that gives me the least number of significant figures. So in this case, it would be the 420. I'm choosing it because when I get to the very end, it gives me the number with the least number of significant figures. So I've carried significant figures through the multiplication. Now I've carried them through the addition to end up with the correct number of significant figures in my answer, which is 2 with an answer of 420. That's significant figures in a multi-step problem. That's how I'd like you to model doing all the different significant figure calculations you're going to do throughout the entire semester. And that means every calculation that you might work on. This is the problem that we looked at previously. Okay, we looked at this in the problem right immediately before this. And in this one we said these parentheses were here around the multiplication. And so that didn't necessarily change the way we might work on this problem. But now we're going to throw them into this particular mathematical problem in such a way that it is going to alter the order at which we are going to do this calculation. By placing it around the addition, all right, we now are making it such that we have to do the addition before we do the multiplication. That's backward from the way it was before. So now we're going to do the addition, then we're going to do the multiplication and see exactly how this changes the number of significant figures in our answer. So we're going to work on this problem first. Again, I've left a number of significant figures in each of the numbers above. So we've got 112 and we've got our 4.5. So we're going to take 112 and we're going to add 4.5 to it. All right. So when we do this problem again, we're lining up the decimal places just like we did in elementary school. Now we have to, however, figure out to what place is each significant. So remember we did this before. We said, okay, there are 3 significant figures in 112. So the place to which that number is significant is 1, 2, 3. is significant to the 2. And we look at 4.5, and there are 2 significant figures in 4.5, so we're going to figure out that it's significant to not the 4, but the 5. 1, 2. Put a mark above each of those. Now go ahead and do the addition. So we'll do the 5 and the 6, and we get 116.5. We said we're not done because we had to bring down the marks, and we have a choice. We could have 117, significant to the 6th place. The 5 is greater than, or the 5 or greater, we would round up. So we're going to round that to 117, and that would have 3 significant figures. Now we're going to round it to the 5. If we take the 5, we look to the digit next. There's nothing there, so we consider it a 0. 0 is less than 5, so we'd leave it as it is. 116.5 with 4 significant digits. And so we're not necessarily going to do this to get our answer, because remember, I've been harping on you about the idea of not rounding until the end of the problem. So what this is telling us is that indeed, if this were the only portion of the problem that we were going to do, the answer would be 117. But most importantly for us, we know that this number that we've calculated should have 3 significant figures. So it's got 3 significant figures to it. So now we know we can carry it forward in this problem. When we do this, it would be 116.5 with 3 significant figures, and I'm going to multiply it by 67.89. That number, we said, had 4 significant figures. So we've done the first portion of the problem. Now we're doing the second portion of the problem. Even though we're writing more than those 3 digits, we're keeping track of how many significant figures that we have. That way, whenever we do the problem, we can round at the very end. We've only rounded once in our problem, so we don't have to round multiple times. Because you'd be amazed that if you round multiple times, what happens is your problem ends up being off by a significant percentage, sometimes up to 25% or more, by rounding it multiple times throughout a problem. So it's better to wait and multiply at the very end. So now I'm going to multiply this, and I'm going to get 7,909.185. Now I've got a task, finding how many significant figures that number should be. Remember, we said addition and subtraction was sort of the more complicated one. When we're multiplying and dividing, we have a number with 3 and a number with 4. We just choose the smallest amount of significant figures, and our answer should have 3 significant figures. How do we figure out which digits are significant? Well, we start counting from the left. 1, 2, 3. It's going to be significant to that place right there. So, if we want to write our answer, we would take that digit, look to the right. If it's 5 or greater, we would round that place up. So we get 7,910. 3 significant figures. And that would be our answer. Now remember, the previous portion of the problem, we ended up with an answer that only had 2 significant figures. So the order of operations can control or affect the number of significant figures that we end up with in our answer. So you have to remember to take into account the order of operations, and if you don't know how to do that, please come to talk to me about it, because if you can't do order of operations, the math going forward is going to be so difficult for you. So we need to get that straightened out now. But that we need to take into account the order of operations as well as the significant figures, and that order can have an effect on how many significant figures we end up with. That's really a pretty exhaustive, between the last problem and this one problem, an exhaustive coverage of significant figures. This is going to cover all of the different cases that we're going to see throughout the semester. So if you can master this and you understand it, you're going to be good going forward and not be throwing as many points away on having the incorrect number of significant figures.